Chapter 1. A sound bell rings the same. The bronze went still in the mold, and I let it. That was the whole art of it, the letting. Pour too fast and you got bubbles, hairline fractures, a bell that thudded instead of sang. Too slow, and the metal cooled unevenly, the grain splitting inward at the seam. You poured in one long breath, and then you stepped back and waited for the system to tell you what you'd made. The mold was iron, pitted dark from a decade of use, and the handbell inside it still glowed orange at the edges, the heat bleeding out in slow pulses. 32 seconds this pour. The foundry stood half open to the yard, and Greywold's winter air came off the moor and did my work for me. Then the system settled.
Bell cast, resonance, 52. Quality, sound.
52. I held the number a moment, turned it once, then set the next mold on the rack. Sound quality ran from 40 to 69 on the resonance scale. Clear bells, rings you could trust to carry across a square or fill a chapel. This one would find a home at the chandler's shop, or maybe the East Quarter apothecary, who'd been asking for months. They wanted a bell that rang. 52 rang. True was 70. I knew exactly what it cost to get there, and I had decided some time ago that I was not going to pay it. 8 more to pour before dark. That was the whole horizon. Complete this batch, collect the coin, settle the foundry's outstanding debt to the Tinsmith Guild in Harrow, and go. I had been building toward going for 8 months. Small casts, quick sales, no commission work that would tie me here past Gloamtide. The valley had needed bells, and I had made bells, and there was nothing complicated about that. I tipped the crucible, and the next pour ran clean. Goodwife Marta didn't knock. She'd known me since I was 6, had watched me burn my palms on my mother's cooling racks, and she treated my foundry the way she treated everything in this valley, as partly hers by right of having outlasted everyone else. The door swung back on its leather hinge. She came in with her shawl pulled close, and her breath coming white in the cold, and she didn't go to the bench the way she usually did. She stayed near the door. Her hands were folded still at her waist, which was not like her.
2 nights to Gloamtide,
She said.
new moon. The mother bell rang dead at dawn prayer. 3 days running now.
I kept moving. I had another pour staged.
I know the calendar, Marta.
Healer Austin struck it himself yesterday. Thought maybe it needed the cold to settle.
She took one step further in and let the door swing behind her.
Dead each time. Same dead sound it's made since the crack last winter. Rings like a broken pot.
Bells crack.
I said.
The tone goes.
Ward bells don't go flat. Ward bells go silent. You know that.
I finished the pour and stepped back and let the mold sit.
The gloam presses closest on the new moon.
Marta said.
Every child in this valley learns it before they learn their letters. We cannot walk into Gloamtide with the mother bell dead.
Stories to frighten children.
I said.
Gloamtide comes and goes every year, and the valley holds, with or without mothers shaking their aprons about the moor.
I stripped one glove and set it on the workbench.
If the bell is cracked, send to Harrow. A proper guild foundry can fit a commission.
2 weeks, minimum. We have 2 nights.
Neither of us spoke. The new mold ticked as the bronze contracted inside it. She was still standing by the door. In the 4 years since I'd come back to this valley, Marta had never stood still in my foundry. She brought her opinions and her unsolicited suggestions and deposited them near the work table. She examined my castings without being invited. She had once rearranged the tool hooks while I was in the middle of a pour, but she had not moved from the door, and her hands had not moved at all.
I don't come to you for nothing,
She said. Not to me, to the bells cooling on the rack, the sound ones, the ones that would leave the valley.
I know you've a debt to clear. I know you want to be gone.
A pause.
I'm only saying Gloamtide is 2 nights away, and the valley has one bell that matters, and it rings like a broken pot.
The ward.
I started and stopped. I'd been about to say something about inertia, About how ward tone didn't simply vanish because the bell was cracked. About how the valley had probably been coasting for months with no harm done. I had practiced that argument. It was a good argument, as arguments went. I picked up my glove instead.
I'll think on it.
I said, which was the closest I'd come to an outright lie that day. She gave me the look she'd given me at 12 when I'd said something technically true and thoroughly wrong. Mouth pressed, one eyebrow up, the exact interval of silence that meant she knew I knew better. Then she went to the door.
One more thing.
She stopped with her hand on the frame.
There's a man come down the valley road. Arrived last evening, stayed at the Miller's Arms. Dressed guild, Founders Guild, coat and pin. He was buying rounds with the cattlemen this morning, asking questions.
A pause.
Asking who has the foundry that's been selling the valley its bells. By name, Wren. Asking for the founder.
She left before I could ask what he'd been told. I stood with the crucible in my hands and the fire breathing behind me, and 8 bells cooling on the rack, bright and sound and perfectly, completely inert. A guild factor. Here, asking for me by name. Something cold moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the draft off the moor. I set the crucible down and told myself to think. How much they knew, how much they'd only guessed, whether the difference still mattered. And I could not get there. The bronze had gone past its poor temperature while I was standing still, gone too hot, and I'd have to let it cool back or I'd cast a bell that would shatter on first strike. The bronze cooled, and I tried to convince myself I still had a plan. Chapter 2. The Tuning Fork. The bronze cooled, and I poured 4 bells instead of 8, because 4 was what the temperature gave me when I finally stopped standing still. They came out sound, resonance 49 to 53, the same middling cluster as always, and I stood at the rack adding them to the running count. 27 bells this season, all sound, not one ward tone to show for it. The guild factor knew. That was the shape of what I'd been circling since Marta left. Not that he suspected or had guessed, that he knew, which meant a ledger somewhere, a comparison run against a ward detection instrument, and no version of the conversation ahead where I talked my way past it. I needed my hands on something. The sorting bin had sat full for 2 weeks. Broken ladles, sprue stubs, wire clips, a cracked mold section that had finally given out on the last batch, and I upended it onto the foundry floor and knelt. The work was mindless enough that the tinnitus became audible. Usually it sat below perception during the day, a thin ring I'd learned to slot past. Now it surfaced, a single high note, persistent, like a tuning fork struck in an empty room, and set down but never muffled. The metal in the bin sang against my palms where I touched it, and true listening answered whether I wanted it to or not. The skill was my mother's gift, or its own. Some things choose their host. It reads the flaw line in a melt before the pour, the hairline fracture that will shatter a bell on first strike if you cast it wrong. Passive, it murmurs constantly, mapping the weakness in every piece of metal you touch. Active, pushed into a pour, it guides your hands and ear until the flaw corrects and the melt runs clean, which can lift a borderline cast half a grade, sometimes more. The cost is that you hear all of it, always, and the harder you push the skill, the louder it rings after, a permanent note that never resolves. My mother used to say the metal borrowed the hearing and didn't return it. By the end, she used true listening anyway. I found the fork under a loop of wire. My fingers knew it before I looked. The weight, the 2-tine spread, the steel worn dark along the shaft. A maker's stamp, rubbed to shadow. She had carried it since before I could remember, had used it to strike test tones from cooling bells, had pressed it to her jaw in the last years when the ears stopped working and the bone was all she had left. I held it. True listening surged, passive, reaching for any resonant metal nearby, and the fork hummed faintly against my palm. She had beautiful hands. Before the bells, before the silence. The precision of them, the pore splash scars she'd arranged in her mind as a kind of map. At 12, I stood beside her learning to read a melt by the skill's murmur. Her voice quiet beside my ear. Not wrong, just weak. You hear it and you correct it before you pour. By the time I was 16, her left ear was gone. She pressed her palm flat to every bell to feel the cooling tone through her skin. She stopped correcting me in sentences and started guiding my hands instead, because watching a mouth was faster than waiting for a voice she half couldn't hear. She never poured a bell below true. Resonance 72, 74, 78. Ward carriers, every one. Her founder's voice threaded into every pour. That was the thing she explained the night before the final pour. She sat me at the workbench by lamplight and told me the thing no one wrote down, because writing it down only frightened people. To cast a true bell, the founder sings, her own tone, the specific pitch her body makes in resonance, threaded into the falling bronze. The metal takes it, keeps it. A living voice bound into the bell is what holds the ward tone, what separates true from sound. You cannot fake it with technique. Only a real voice, put in at the moment of casting, and the ward holds because something of the founder stays in the bell. The price is that the bell keeps the tone permanently. The ear that shaped it never hears that frequency again. A little missing for a small true bell. More for a great one. A masterwork pour in a single casting can strip half of what remains if the founder's reserves are thin. My mother poured her last bell the next morning. A re-pour on a cracked section of the mother bell's ward flange. A bell she had already given too much to over too many years. The toll came due, and the world went quiet for her inside the time it took the bronze to set, and it never came back. I set the tuning fork on the workbench where I could see it. I did not put it away.
I've been reading,
Pell said from the doorway. He was 17 and long-limbed, hands clasped behind his back. The posture he took when he had something to say that he expected refused. The latch hadn't sounded. 3 years my apprentice, and I had taught him every corner of bell casting except the one that mattered.
Reading what?
I said.
the journals under your bench. I know they were hers.
He stopped.
I was looking for the script ledger.
Those aren't instruction manuals.
No, but she wrote about the voice.
The tinnitus rang in my left ear, thin and steady.
What do you want, Pell?
His hands came from behind his back. He looked at the tuning fork on the bench, then at me.
Teach me the true pour, the real one.
True listening knew this feeling before I did. Flaw already set, bronze already cooling, nothing left to correct.
No.
I've watched you 3 years. I know you do something different at the...
I do something different, and it costs me hearing I do not get back. Every true pour, the bell takes a piece of what made it. My mother poured bells for 40 years, and the last one took everything she had left. She was deaf before the bronze set. The craft only takes, Pell. It does not give back.
Silence.
There's something I have to show you.
The voice of a boy who had already done the thing.
When?
I said.
2 nights ago, the small hearth.
He did not look at me.
I've watched how you hold your jaw when you pour, how you go quiet right before. I thought if I tried to sing a tone into the melt.
You don't know the voice.
No, I don't.
He reached into his coat and held it out. A small bell, 4 inches, rough at the seam where he'd cast it without a mold guide. A cold, clean fracture ran all the way around the shoulder.
Bell cast. Resonance 18. Cracked. Founder's toll. Hearing -1. Voice attempt. Null transfer.
This came up when it cooled.
He turned the bell over in his hands, not looking at me.
I don't know what null transfer means. I don't know what it took from me.
Chapter 3. The Factor's Offer. I took the bell from Pell's hands because it gave me something to do with my face. Null transfer. The system had logged it cleanly, the way it logged everything. The attempt was real. The cost was real. The voice simply had not been there to give. He'd held his jaw the way I hold mine. He'd gone quiet at the crucible. And then he'd sung into empty air, and the bell had cracked, and taken one measure of hearing from a boy who had never had the voice to lose. The system had logged it as a null transfer, the same notation I could still see at the edge of my sight. His panel, not mine, which meant it had logged me as witness or as the responsible party. I wasn't sure which was worse.
You'll never do that again.
I said. The bell was cold in my hands. The fracture ran clean as a ruled line.
Not alone, and not without telling me.
Pell looked up.
So you'll teach me?
I didn't say that.
I'd meant to leave the door open. The words hadn't. He dropped his gaze to the floor, and I set the cracked bell face down on the corner of the work table. Outside, the morning was still gray. 2 days to Gloamtide, and the sky had already given up on color. I was still standing there with both hands empty when the foundry door swung open. The man who stepped in had mud on his boots and none anywhere else. That was a particular kind of intention. He was perhaps 40, fair-haired, going gray at the temples, wearing a guild factor's badge on his breast like an afterthought, the way a man wears wealth when he doesn't need to prove it. He moved through the foundry with his gaze traveling from rack to furnace to mold row, patient and unhurried.
Wren Alder.
He smiled at the bell molds ranked along the far wall.
A fine operation. Small, yes, but orderly. I'm Cassian Voss. I think you've been expecting me.
Pell hadn't moved either. Voss let the silence sit with the ease of a man comfortable in a room he already owns.
Pell,
I said.
get out.
Wren.
I'm not asking.
He went, taking the cracked bell with him. His steps slowed once in the yard, listening in case I called him back. I didn't.
You have a good ear, Mistress Alder.
Voss crossed to the cooling rack and crouched, tilting his head at last week's bells. He tapped one with a ringed finger. It rang sound, resonance somewhere in the low 50s, and straightened with the expression of a man confirming what he already suspected.
All your bells this season sit at 50 or above. Genuinely impressive.
You didn't walk from the valley road to compliment my castings.
No.
He opened the satchel at his hip with the ease of a man opening his own front door. The ledger he drew out was well thumbed.
I came because not one ward tone has left your forge in 12 months.
My jaw set. That was the only thing that moved. Ward tone was the piececraft alone couldn't provide. When a founder poured true, what rang from the first strike wasn't just sound. It was her voice, threaded alive into the alloy, carried in the metal's grain, and in the air both. That living note was what the Gloam could not cross. A hollow bell rang just as bright, just as clear, and stopped nothing. You couldn't hear the difference, not standing in a warm foundry in daylight. The fraud was perfect until the dark came walking through your ward like the wall wasn't there. I had told myself one winter's hollow bells wouldn't tip it, that the mother bell still held the valley's heart, cracked and dying or not. His green eyes were patient, kind even, in a way that made it worse.
I don't say this to wound you. The guild tracks ward tone output across every registered foundry in the district. Yours has been 0.
He turned a page.
Your predecessor, your mother, never filed a sound bell in her final decade. She understood the obligation.
A pause that felt less like hesitation than punctuation.
I'm prepared to believe you found yourself in difficult circumstances.
My predecessor, her final decade, which was also her deaf decade, which ended on a cold morning in a pour she hadn't chosen.
What do you want, Factor?
Simplicity.
He set the ledger on the edge of my work table, as though it belonged there.
Sell the foundry. The guild pays a fair price. I have the figures. We install a guild-certified bell set for the valley and the surrounding settlements. You walk away with your debt cleared. Greywold walks away with proper bells, and no one—
He studied a thumbnail.
Need learn the valley has been walking unworded for a year.
The furnace popped. A small coal fell.
And the mother bell?
An heirloom. Cracked, yes, and the village is frightened.
He said it gently, the way a doctor discusses a patient's feelings rather than their prognosis.
Our bells are adequate to the situation.
the situation being Gloamtide in 2 nights.
The situation being a moor mist that peasants have dressed up as a monster.
No heat in it, just the patience of someone who has said this many times, to many frightened people, in many frightened towns.
Mistress Alder, I grew up in Heron by the Moor, 20 years in guild houses across this district. I have never once seen anyone killed by the dark. The Gloam is a name people give to the anxiety of a new moon, and the ward tone is a story founders tell to charge more for their bells.
A small pause.
You know this. You've been selling sound bells for a year. You understand the Gloam as well as I do.
And the terrible thing was how much I wanted him to be right. The silence stretched. Voss didn't fill it. He was very good at waiting.
I won't sell.
The kindness didn't leave his face. It slid sideways into something wearing the same shape.
I was afraid of that.
He reached into the satchel again. The document he drew out was heavy paper, sealed with gilt green wax. He walked to my foundry door and drove the attached nail through it with the heel of his palm. 3 blows, unhurried, each landing clean. Stronger than he looked.
Guild Condemnation writ. Authorizes seizure of your production and suspension of your registration, effective Gloamtide.
He tucked the satchel shut.
Consider it a courtesy. You have 2 nights to decide otherwise.
He left. The door swung on its hinge, and through the gap I could see the writ pressed flat against the wood, the lane beyond already empty of him. The furnace ticked. Through the far window the hills ran the color of old ash. I didn't move for a long time. Then I went to the door and read the writ without touching it. Gloamtide, stamped in gilt green at the bottom, and thought about how cleanly it had all been arranged. He'd bought my metal somewhere. I was certain of it now, the way you're certain of a flaw line before the tinnitus even rises. Every ingot, every scrap bronze in the district, spoken for and paid double before he'd ever walked through my door. The writ was not a last resort. It was the second step of a plan, with a third already written. I pulled my mother's tuning fork from my belt and held it until the metal warmed in my palm, which was a habit and not a decision. 2 nights. No tin, no bronze, a valley full of hollow bells, and a cracked mother bell that hadn't held a ward tone since winter. I was going to do something. I just couldn't see what I still had left to do it with. Chapter 4. Dead Tone. I stood in the foundry long after Voss's footsteps had faded up the lane. The tuning fork was still warm in my grip from the borrowed heat of my palm, which meant I'd been holding it longer than I'd meant to. 3 winters ago, I'd watched my mother hold the same fork the same way. I'd thought she was praying. She wasn't. She was working up the nerve to find out what she already knew. I set the fork on the anvil block and crossed to the drying shelf. The handbells from this morning's pour sat in their cooling frames, 9 of them, each stamped with my maker's mark while the wax was still warm. Alder Foundry, Greywold, my bells, my name on every one. I picked up the 3rd from the left, a good shape. The lip had set clean, no drips. Someone in the valley had paid 8 silvers for it, or would, and they'd hang it over their gate, or their sheepfold, or the loft where their children slept, and feel the ordinary, particular safety that a ward bell is supposed to provide. I struck my mother's tuning fork against my wrist bone, the old way, the way she'd taught me before I was old enough to understand what I was learning. The tone hummed through my teeth and jaw. I let true listening open.
True listening. Resonance. 51. Sound. Ward tone. Absent.
The bell rang clean and clear, and entirely dead. I'd always known. I'd cast it in the mode I'd cast every bell this past year. Sound pours, deliberate, no voice threaded in, no ward tone sealed into the metal. But there is a difference between knowing a thing in the part of your mind that keeps ledgers, and hearing it confirmed through bone and jaw, and a skill you learned from a woman who went deaf using it. My hands were steady. Shock is for things you didn't know, and I had known. This was something else entirely. The weight of something that had been standing on the other side of a door for 12 months. waiting for me to stop holding it shut. 27 bells this season, a winter's worth before that. The whole valley walking unworded toward the new moon, trusting my name on the wax. I put the bell back in its frame very carefully, the way you set something down when you can't trust your hands. I was 8 the night the Gloam came through. My mother had been pouring true for 20 years by then, and the tinnitus had been climbing for the last 5. A high, fine note, she said, lived behind her right eye and never left. She'd started reading lips by lamplight without quite admitting to herself she was doing it. Across the supper table, I tracked her eyes fixing on mouths a half-second too long before she answered. I kept quiet, because she was my mother, and that was the kind of knowing you learned to carry without setting down. She'd gone out after supper to recast Farmer Holt's ward bell. Too young, she'd told me. Bank the hearth and go to bed. But I'd stayed in the foundry after she left and poured the bell myself on the small hearth. Raw hands on the ladle. 8 years old, certain I was sparing her. I didn't ask what I was doing. I poured sound, no voice, clean and bright and inert. I'd left it cooling on the mold lip and gone to bed pleased with myself. By midnight there was screaming in the lower field. She survived the night. She lost the last of the hearing in her right ear to the emergency pour she did in the dark, working by feel, and a skill that cost her each time she used it, while the gloam pressed through the gap my bell had left. I never told her what I'd cast. I told myself I hadn't understood what I was doing. I repeated that story until it replaced the other one. Now the gap I'd torn in Holt's fence line had become an entire valley. I crossed to the window. The mother bell hung dark and silent in the square, a crack running from the lip halfway up the skirt. I could leave. I'd planned to leave. The debt to the Tinsmiths Guild in Harrow didn't care about Gloamtide, and Voss had the Condemnation writ and the pre-bought bronze and the patience of a man who'd already won. He'd offered me an exit, sell the foundry, let someone else be responsible for the valley's wards. Part of me had spent the last year living as if I'd already taken it. Hollow bells and a clean story. I put the tuning fork on my belt. The mother bell needed to be recast before Gloamtide. I needed tin and bronze, which meant I needed to move before anyone else thought to look. Sutter's Forge in Millhaven was first. Bram Sutter met me at the door with his hands already spread before I'd finished dismounting.
Whatever you have, scrap tin, plate bronze, shavings off the floor.
Had it this morning, he said. He had the face of a man who'd finished feeling bad about something. Fellow came before first light. Paid double asking. Spot coin. Wanted it loaded and gone before the market opened. I tried the second smithy on Millhaven's West Lane. The door was bolted, and a sign in the window said, "Closed for inventory." Caldwell's scrapyard in Fenwick was similarly dark. A neighbor leaning on the fence told me Caldwell had taken his family to visit his brother in Asham after a very profitable dawn. The factor's warehouse in Asham dealt in tin from the coast, the last place I'd expected to be cleared out, because the coastal shipments run slow this time of year. The factor came out himself, a thin man with a ledger still tucked under his arm, who directed his answer at the ground between us.
When did the order come in?
Yesterday evening, by Fast Rider. We loaded overnight. A pause. Full warehouse to nothing by cockcrow, if it matters. It mattered. I sat on the gray mare in Asham's yard and worked out the timing. The orders had gone out before Voss walked through my foundry door, before the writ, before the offer, before the conversation I'd spent 2 days dreading. The bronze had been spoken for while he was still 2 days down the valley road, smiling at strangers and calling the Gloam a bedtime story. I turned the mare toward home. 2 nights to Gloamtide. The forges were bare. A valley full of hollow bells and a mother bell dark and cracked in the village square. The mother bell, still hanging, still bronze. Chapter 5. The only bronze in the valley. The gray mare knew the road home. I let her find it. My hands stayed loose on the reins and I did not try to think. Not yet. Thinking meant numbers. And the numbers were unbearable. All the tin in the district spoken for before Voss reached my door. all the bronze. Every smelter from Asham to Millhaven, cleared by orders that had gone out 2 days before he ever walked into my foundry. 2 nights to Gloamtide. The mother bell. No comfort in that. A worse kind of answer. She hung in the village square where she had always hung. 600 pounds of valley bronze cast 200 years ago, by a founder whose name the valley still carried, and mine never would. 4 generations of true bells had held back the Gloam. The last repour had been my mother's. The bell had cracked last winter, the ward gone dark with it, and the only mass of bronze large enough to recast her true was the bell herself. I would have to break the mother bell to save it. The mare plodded into Greywold as the light went flat. Pell was at the foundry gate, arms folded, face arranged in the stillness he kept when he had something to say, and was afraid of my answer.
Where's Marta?
Market side of the square. Wren.
I need her first.
Goodwife Marta was at the common well with 2 other women. She saw my face and set down her bucket without speaking.
You found no metal.
She said,
Voss bought it. All of it. Every smelter in the district. Cleared before he came to see me.
My hands, at my sides, were very still.
There is one source of bronze left. One mass large enough to recast a bell with sufficient resonance to hold the ward.
She waited. She was good at waiting.
The mother bell.
Marta's face was stone for 3 full seconds. Then she drew a slow breath through her nose.
You mean to break her?
She's cracked already. The ward tone's gone. Has been since last winter. She hangs there looking like safety while providing none. Melt her down, recast her true, and you have a real bell again. If I don't.
She has hung there 200 years.
And she can hang 200 more after the recast. It's the same bronze.
It is not the same bell.
One of the women behind Marta had gone very still, water forgotten. Word moved faster than feet in this square. 2 men near the dry goods stall had already turned our way, reading posture, reading the goodwife's face. The square feels like that when something is being decided. No running, no shouting. Just gathering, the way iron filings orient to a lodestone.
Marta.
I made myself slow down.
Gloamtide is the day after tomorrow. The ward has been dark since last winter. The valley needs a true bell. That bell is the only bronze.
Then go find bronze elsewhere.
Her jaw had tightened.
You're the founder. That's what you're owed the shop. And the license for.
I have tried. There is no elsewhere left.
She looked at me the way you look at a wall you have decided not to climb. The men from the dry goods stall had drifted over. Another woman. One of the smithy boys. Pell materialized at my shoulder, silent, because he had seen my face. Then papers. Voss stood at the far end of the square with 2 men I did not know, guild stitch on their collars, moving from door to door without hurry. He was unhurried in the way of a man explaining something to a room that has already been arranged. They tacked pages to door frames, to the notice board post, to the frame of the market stall nearest the Mother Bell's tower.
What is that?
Someone behind me said. I crossed the square. Pell kept pace. The sheet was printed in clean guild type, the sort that costs more than most foundries earn in a season. At the top, public notice, foundry registration status, Wren Alder, Greywold District. Below, a column of dates, inspection records, system-logged resonance readouts from a year's worth of bells, all of them sound tier, none at or above resonance 70. No ward tone in 12 months. Behind me, someone read it aloud. A woman's voice, stumbling over the numbers, and the numbers were plain enough even stumbled over.
I had wished for a private resolution.
Voss had come up beside me, gradual, already there. He looked at Marta, who had followed. He looked at the crowd, which was not small.
The district's welfare obliges disclosure when a registered founder requests authority over community property, given the registration record in question.
Is it true?
Marta asked. Not Voss. Me. A beat, too.
Yes.
I said. The square went quiet. the way a forge goes quiet when you quench a bad pour.
Then you will not lay a hand on the mother bell.
She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without theater, and there was a finality in it that had nothing to do with volume. The people around her didn't need to say anything. Their silence was the agreement. Voss said nothing. He didn't need to. I stood in the square with the proof of my own year's work tacked to the notice board 10 feet from my shoulder, and the mother bell hanging dark above us all, and 2 nights left before the new moon.
The furnace.
Pell said, at my elbow.
If we're going to do anything with it, anything at all, it needs 6 hours to reach true pour heat.
He left the rest of the sentence where it was. 6 hours I did not have permission to start. Chapter 6. Alone at the mold. I lit the foundry lamps myself. The square had emptied by the time I crossed it again. Not all at once, not in any rush, just people turning their backs one by one the way a flock turns, until I was the last one in it. Pell was gone with the crowd. I didn't call after him. The furnace was cold. 6 hours to true pour heat. No bronze to pour. No permission to touch the only bronze that existed. I prepped the casting pit anyway, because the hands needed work, and standing still in the middle of the floor was the kind of thing that ended with me on the road north. I raked the ash bed, cleared the tuyere grates, threaded the flue rod down the stack until it came back scorched from the day's banked heat. Ordinary foundry work, the sort I could do in darkness. The lamps threw orange light down into the pit and lit the mold frame I had set and bolted but not filled, waiting on bronze that wasn't mine to touch. Outside, Greywold kept its evening sounds. Doors, livestock, the clank of sutler's hammer drifting from his smithy. Hollow bells ring exactly like true ones. Nobody knows what they're missing until the Gloam walks through. I was sorting mold pins, 17 counted, 24 needed, when Voss's voice slid under the foundry door.
Master Pell.
A pause.
The guild has a place for you. Journeyman rank, city wages, a working furnace that doesn't run on Greywold credit. No debt attached.
I set down the pins.
She's going to pour tonight. You know it, and I know it. And by dawn, the smoke from that stack will tell the whole village. When she does, with no bronze, no guild standing, a condemnation writ nailed to her door, there won't be anything left here to inherit. Walk away now and you're not a deserter. You're a man with sense.
I counted 17 pins. I needed 7 more.
The guild doesn't ask you to choose between your master and your future,
He said, quieter now.
It simply offers you one.
His footsteps moved away across the square. Not Pell's, just his. He'd left the offer sitting in the air the way a bell leaves its note. Long after the ring stopped, the frequency stayed. I went back to finding pins. The tinnitus lifted. Not much, a quarter tone maybe, the kind of shift that could be fatigue, or a backed-up flu, or nothing at all. But I'd strained true listening 2 hours ago in the square, driving the fork against my wrist bone to confirm what I already knew about the mother bell, and the ring hadn't settled back. Like a string you can't unplumb, my mother had said once. It just keeps pulling. By the end, she'd stopped explaining. By the end, the words for it were gone. Her last pour was the Ashfield mother bell, 3 valleys east. She rode 2 days, poured alone, came back with her hands shaking, and the right side of her world simply absent. I'd said something to her at the foundry table that first evening home, standing 2 feet away, and she'd turned her head slowly, searching for the direction of the sound, and her eyes swept right through me before settling on the wrong wall. She died less than a year later. Not from Ashfield, from the 6 small true bells she took after it, because the work kept arriving and there was no one else. 7 years of knowing my part in it, the sound bell I'd cast at 8 to spare her 1 true pour, the gap it cut in Farmer Holt's ward, the emergency re-pour she made in the dark while the Gloam pressed through. I'd carried that just fine. What I had refused to carry was the part that came before. She would have poured Ashfield regardless. she would have taken all 6 bells after it. Because she was the only one who knew how, and she believed, truly believed, that the cost of a hollow bell was always paid by someone else. I had believed the same thing. For a year I had believed it very hard. I put my hands on the rim of the casting pit. The road north was a real road. The debt in Harrow was survivable. The tinnitus would follow me wherever I went, but I could carry it to a city where nobody rang bells in my presence, and nobody knew the founder's toll, and there was a life in that. Smaller than this one, but mine. I ran through it until I hit the part I couldn't get past. 2 nights from now. Gloamtide. Which house sat at the south edge of the ward, and who slept in it? The village had stood in the square and let Voss nail my year of hollow work to the notice board. And that was true, and it didn't change the arithmetic. I had already put one person in the path of the Gloam by choosing the cheaper thing. I couldn't make that choice twice. The toll would come due on a true poor. My mother had paid it again and again because the work kept arriving, and she was the only one who could answer it. I was not my mother. But I was here, I knew how, and those 2 things together had a weight I was done arguing with. The furnace needed lighting. I had no bronze, and no permission, and Pell was gone. I reached for the bellows arm. The door opened before I touched it. Pell stepped through, hat in hand, the evening chill still in his jacket. He'd been outside long enough to feel it.
I told him no.
He said. He crossed to the coal stack on the far wall without looking at me, and started measuring out the first bin.
He made a decent case. City wages, journeyman rank, probably not lying about either.
He picked up a second bin without setting the first down.
Wanted me gone tonight, though, before the pour.
He finally looked up.
If I'm gone before you pour, I'm not just, that's not leaving a bad job.
He set both bins down and hung the measure on its hook.
That's picking his side. 3 years. I'm not picking his side.
There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't embarrass us both, so I said nothing.
There's a problem.
Pell said. He turned to face the cold furnace.
I've been working through the heat, 6 hours to true pour temperature, from banked coals, 2 people on bellows in rotation, 20 minutes on and 20 off. Done it with you twice.
He looked at the ash-gray firebox.
The furnace is cold, Wren. Genuinely cold, and we've lost the afternoon.
He stood with the empty measure in both hands.
2 people pumping from ash cold. I don't think we make true pour heat before Gloamtide. We'd top out short.
The lamplight sat between us. Somewhere outside, Greywold was going about its unworded evening.
How short?
I said.
I don't know.
His jaw set.
Maybe a lot.
Chapter 7. Breaking the Bell. The question hung there. How short was not a question I could answer, because it was not a question Pell could answer, and neither of us had the heat hours to stand debating it. I crossed to the tool wall and took down the long-handled sledge. Then the short one. I held the short one out to Pell.
Come on.
I said. He stared at the sledge. Then he took it. The village square was quiet in a way that tightened the skin between my shoulders. Not the good quiet of a sleeping town. The held-breath quiet of one listening for something it didn't want to hear. Marda's shutters were dark. Voss's borrowed rooms above the Chandlers would be dark too. Even the dogs had gone inside. The mother bell hung in her frame between the elder tree and the wellhead, the way she had hung for 60 years. I had been 8 the last time she sounded true. She was cracked now, a split running from crown to shoulder on the east-facing side, black in the torchlight, dead when you struck her. 600 pounds of valley bronze, the district's last, doing nothing. I set the torch in the ground socket by the frame post, lifted the long sledge. Pell said.
60 years.
Yes.
I said. I drove the hammer into the crack. The sound she made was wrong in a way I felt through the handle before I heard it. Not a bell's voice, not even a dead one, but a flat crack like ice giving. The flaw ran further than it looked. 60 years of freeze and thaw and the bell's own weight had worked the split deep. And when I hit her a second time, A whole arc of bronze came free and rang against the cobbles with a noise like a dropped coin. A shard. We worked for 2 hours in the square. Nobody came out to stop us. Nobody came out at all. The furnace was cold, and the night was deep by the time we'd loaded the last barrow. Pell had stacked the broken bronze into the crucible in layers. Big pieces first the way I'd taught him, and I set the kindling myself and got the first fire going with my back to the draft. His bellows work was better than mine now. Steadier rhythm, better endurance. And I stepped aside and let him pump while I watched the color change in the firebox. Bronze has no interest in your schedule.
20 on, 20 off.
I said.
Tell me when your shoulders go.
Right.
He said, and started pumping. I sat on the casting stool and watched the fire climb. The tinnitus was already up from the square, from straining true listening against 60 years of bad resonance when I checked the crack, and the coming hours were not going to help it. I had told myself I would hold the skill back, not ride the melt until it was worth reading. But the waiting made the ringing worse, not better, because I kept listening anyway, the passive edge of the skill tasting the air for what the metal was doing, and the silence past the foundry walls was too complete. Greywold's dogs had gone inside before we even left for the square. They had not come back out. I did not think about that. Pell woke me at what he reckoned was the 4th hour mark.
Colors where you said to watch.
He told me.
Dull red going orange.
I went to the firebox. He was right. Not right on the money, maybe 20 degrees below where I wanted to see it, but climbing. I pressed the heel of my wrist against the fire brick. True listening opened like putting your tongue to cold iron, the good hurt of a sense landing on something true. I let it run, tracing the melt through the crucible wall, reading the flaw signature in the bronze. The seam was the size of my forearm. Every piece of metal carries a record of what broke it. Wren's law, my mother had called it. Not a law the system recognized, just a thing every founder learned before their first true pour. Cracked bronze remembers the crack. The flaw line runs in the crystal structure even after the metal melts, a ghost of old stress that has to be driven out by heat and time and knowing where to look, or it reseeds itself when the metal cools. The mother bell had cracked last winter. She had been cracking for 10 years before that.
True listening. Melt analysis. Segregation fault detected. Copper tin stratification. 4.1%. Resonance ceiling projected at current composition. 58. Sound. Purge required to raise ceiling. Estimated purge window at current heat. 50 to 70 minutes. Warning. Ceiling locks at pour.
I stood with my wrist against the fire brick for a long time. A bell cast at resonance 58 would ring as clear and bright as any I'd pulled from this mold. It would hang in its frame and catch the light, and everyone who heard it would say, yes, there's the mother bell. There she is, and they would not know. I knew exactly what that sounded like. I had been casting bells at 52 for a year. The sound threshold was 40. The ward threshold was 70. There were 12 points between 58 and safe, and the melt would not bridge them on its own.
Pell.
I said.
I heard it.
He hadn't stopped pumping.
What's 58?
12 points short of the ward threshold.
I pulled my wrist back. The tinnitus spiked and held.
Purging buys us ceiling room, but it costs time we might not have.
He kept pumping.
What happens at 58?
Same thing as if we light no fire at all.
I said. He pumped 3 more strokes.
Then purge it.
I turned back to the firebox. Riding a melt with true listening open, tracking the flaw line through its stages, holding the skill hot enough to read crystal structure rather than just surface tone, is the kind of use that costs for weeks after. My mother had done it on every true pour. On every large commission she had held it open for 4, 5, 6 hours at a time, reading the melt the way another woman might read a letter. I had watched her come out of those sessions with dried blood at the corner of her lip, and walked away each time, telling myself I would never. I held the skill open for 73 minutes. The flaw line broke by stages. Not evenly, not cooperatively, but in the grudging way of old metal that has been a certain shape for a long time and resents being asked to change. Every 20 minutes I would read the melt and find the seam smaller, thinner, retreating toward the center of the crucible, and every 20 minutes the ring in my right ear climbed another step. Pell did not stop pumping. The light through the high window was wrong, thin and gray-washed, the quality of sea cloud, flattening shadow. It was still hours before any kind of dusk should have touched the moor. I had lived in Greywold long enough to know what sea cloud looked like, and this was not sea cloud.
Pell.
I see it.
He said. The birds had been going quiet by degrees for the past half hour. I had been not thinking about it with the particular attention I reserve for things I cannot afford to reckon with. The moor birds, the curlews, the lapwings, the sparrows in the eaves of the mill. They don't stop calling in the afternoon unless something has changed in the air that they understand better than people do. The last curlew had cried 20 minutes ago. I remembered it because I'd been reading the melt and the sound had cut through clean, the way sounds do when the ring in your ears reaches a certain pitch, and everything else gets briefly, brutally clear. I set my wrist to the fire brick one more time.
True listening. Melt analysis. Segregation fault, 0.3%. Within cast tolerance. Resonance ceiling projected, 68 to 71. True range. Fracture memory may suppress. Heat. 91% of true pore threshold and climbing.
68 to 71. 1 point over the ward threshold if the fracture memory had cleared, 2 points short if it hadn't. Which end we'd hit, the pore would answer.
Flaws purged.
I said.
Ceilings between 68 and 71.
Pell set down the bellows handle and looked at the high window with its flat, wrong light. His jaw moved once.
That's not afternoon, and that's not cloud.
No.
I said. Outside, across the moor, nothing sang. Chapter 8. The Myth Walks. The pewter had crept to the top of the window by the time I let myself look at it properly. The light off the moor rose from the ground up, ash-water color, not falling from the sky, and it moved with weight. I knew that light. My mother had described it once, on a night I'd been too young to see, the way color bleeds out of the world before the gloam presses close, starting at the moor's edge and spreading inward.
Wren.
Pell had stepped back from the bellows. He was looking at the same window.
Keep pumping.
The melt was at 91%. The flaw was purged. We had 15 minutes, maybe. We needed 15 minutes. I set my wrist to the fire brick.
True listening. Melt status. Heat 93% of true pore threshold. Resonance ceiling, 68 to 71. True range. Fracture memory may suppress. Segregation fault, 0.3%.
2% more heat. I pulled my wrist back and made myself pump. The south pasture was a pale smear beyond the glass. Farmer Dewick's cattle had been circling their field since midday, nervous, slow loops around the post where Voss had hung the valley's new bell his first week in Greywold. Gilt bronze. The kind of bell a village saved up 3 harvests for. He'd hung it gratis and made sure everyone saw him do it. It was ringing now. The clapper moved on its own. The gloam's pressure stirred air in ways you felt before you heard, my mother had said. And the bell sang out clear and high and bright. Ward quality. It sounded exactly like a true bell. It had always sounded exactly like a true bell. The gray pressed across the south pasture. The bell rang and rang. The gray did not stop. I stopped breathing. There was a man in the field, a herder, one of Dewick's hands, a figure in a gray coat that now nearly matched the sky. He'd been running for the gate when the bell started, and he'd turned back toward it, trusting it, the way you trust a ward tone that has always protected you before. He got within arm's reach of the post. The gray folded over him without drama, without a sound, the way water fills a boot. What was left was not a death. He stood in the field when the gray had passed, coat undisturbed, hat on, still as a post. The gloam had taken whatever made a man want to walk or shout or flee, and what remained was a shape the same size and color as a person. I stayed at the window. He had trusted a bell that rang exactly right. Pell made a sound against his knuckles. He turned away. I had sold hollow bells for a year, longer if I counted the bells I'd underpoured out of fear, out of the conviction that I was leaving and the risk wasn't mine to carry. I had looked at Greywold and told myself the gloam was probably more missed, and the ward barely mattered with the mother bell still up, and I was leaving anyway, and the valley wasn't mine to protect. 27 bells this season, all of them sound, all of them ringing exactly like something that would keep you alive. The herder stood in the field, and the gray pressed on toward the walls. The foundry door hit the wall so hard the clay slip jars rattled. Cassian Voss came through with his coat still on, and his ledger case under his arm. Even now, the man had come to conduct business, and whatever was unfolding in the south pasture was not going to make him set down his papers.
Stop the pour.
He had the same measured, patient voice he'd used to offer me fair market value for the foundry. Already certain he would be obeyed.
The writ stands. You have no legal right to recast district property, and I have witnesses.
Look out the south window,
I said. His gaze went past me to the furnace, to the covered mold, to the sledgehammers propped against the wall.
The condemnation is dated to Gloamtide,
He said.
Tonight's the night. You're in breach, Alder.
Look out the south window, Voss.
He looked. His bell was still ringing, perfectly audible even from here, the rich, bright chime of quality bronze, singing ward tone into the pressing gray. Tone, composition, weight, everything the guild certified, everything measurable. The gray kept coming. Voss's ledger case stopped swinging. His face found the place where the calculation he'd built his certainty on turned out to have a flaw line he hadn't known to check for. His mouth opened. Nothing came out.
That's
He stopped.
guild-certified bronze. Ward quality specifications. Every bell in this district has been tested to.
What does the guild measure?
I said.
Tone? Composition? Weight?
He didn't answer.
They can't measure the founder's voice. They never could. They measure what a true bell looks like, and you've been selling the valley the appearance of safety for 2 months.
I picked up my mother's tuning fork from the bench. My hands were steadier than they deserved to be.
I've been doing the same thing for a year. Congratulations. We've both been very thorough.
The gray was at the village wall. On the south side of the foundry, where the stonework ran close to the moor, the high windows had gone dark. Not the dark of night, but something with depth pressed flat against glass. Household bells were hanging on posts and lintels all across Greywold. Mine. All sound, all bright, all ringing into nothing. Then the screaming started. They came first in small groups. A family with 2 children in tow, a pair of farmhands still carrying their tools, and then all at once, a rush of bodies and swinging lanterns and loose livestock filling the square outside, flooding up the foundry steps and beating at the door, the only place still lit and hot. Pell had the sense to throw the bolt.
If we open it now,
He said.
Not yet.
Cold air and volume would drop the furnace temperature. I needed to know how much it had already dropped when Voss came through. I set my wrist to the fire brick.
True listening. Heat. 96% of true pour threshold. Time to true pour heat. Estimated 9 minutes.
We'd lost 2% when Voss left the door standing open. 4% still to climb. The hammering outside had built to a rhythm of shoulders and fists, and underneath it, Goodwife Marta's voice cut through oak and iron, banding like she was standing in the same room. Voss hadn't moved from the south window. He was watching his bell, still ringing, still clear, still doing nothing, with the expression of a man auditing a ledger he knows is wrong but can't stop checking.
It should work.
He said, to no one in the room, possibly to himself.
It sounds like it should work.
I said.
That's the whole problem.
The hammering turned to screaming. The specific kind, with a face behind it. The south window. The furnace gauge.
Pell.
I found his eyes across the mold room.
We opened the door at 98, not before.
He looked at the window. He looked at the door. Outside, the screaming had a second voice in it now.
And if the Gloam comes over the wall before 98,
4%. 9 minutes.
Then we open it,
I said.
but not before.
Chapter 9. 68. The furnace hit 98. At the same moment the screaming outside took on a name. Not a word, just a name. Someone calling for a person who was not answering.
Open it.
I said. Pell moved for the bar. The door swung inward, and the cold that came with the crowd was wrong. Not winter, not more fog. It set fingertips and teeth on edge, the way a room does when something in it has been dead for days. A dozen villagers compressed into the mold room, Marta among them, and 2 men I didn't know who smelled of the pasture. One of them was weeping in the high, silent way that meant his throat had given out. Voss came in last. His coat was buttoned wrong. He didn't look at me.
Far wall.
I said.
All of you. Don't touch the mold. Don't touch the crucible feed. Don't get near the pit.
Pell was already moving, gate pins seated, skimmer ready. The ladle hung and pre-warmed in its cradle. 3 years and he'd learned to move before I asked. I pulled the crucible feed, and the melt ran gold into the ladle. I struck the fork against my wrist bone the way my mother taught me, and pressed it to my jaw. The melt came through the fork clean. The purge had done what purges do. Flaw line gone, copper tin even across the whole body, texture smooth from gate to throat. The bell this metal would become rang already in the back of my jaw, clear and steady, the kind of tone that holds a tower through a century without going dead.
Cast quality reading. Melt composition, 0.3% variance. Within tolerance. Resonance ceiling, 68.
68. I kept the fork at my jaw. The melt was not interested in what I needed. The old crack in the mother bell had given up more than the purge pulled out. Not the flaw line, which was gone, but something below it. Bronze has its own kind of memory, and the memory of breaking goes deeper than composition. I'd purged out the fault. The fracture itself had stayed. Sound quality, 40 to 69. This bell would ring, and ward nothing at all. I stood with the fork at my jaw, and 68 sitting in the back of my head, like a figure in a debt ledger that wouldn't close. The ladle sat in the poor cradle. The mold sat in its pit. Pell stood 2 feet from me with his eyes on my face, the way they'd been all night, watching the shape of the thing I hadn't decided yet, learning the decision before I made it. The crowd at the far wall breathed. Voss stood among them, his coat still wrong, face gone flat. The man who'd smiled over a condemnation writ 2 days ago was spent. Whatever he'd been running on had given out in the pasture. I'd known the shape of this decision since I was 8 years old. My mother, the Ashfield Commission, the poor she'd kept me out of the room for, that I'd watched through the window anyway, the way children do. She'd stood exactly where I was standing, ladle up, mold waiting, the toll ahead of her, and she'd sung. She always sang. She paid the toll year after year, because the bells held, and the wards held, and people slept safe, and I had watched her do it, and decided her arithmetic was wrong. That the toll was the problem. That a sound bell which looked safe was the kinder trade, because at least the founder walked away. The thing in the pasture had swallowed a man whole and left him standing, coat undisturbed, everything inside him gone, and it had walked through a guild bell ringing perfect pitch, because pitch was not a ward tone. I'd known that. I'd spent a year selling this valley sound bells with my eyes open, each season telling myself the toll was too high a price, that I was being kinder than she'd been. I had been my mother's hollow bell. I had been doing it for 12 months and calling it mercy. The cold at the windows moved. A lamp on the near bench went out. No draft, no gust, simply ceased. And in the sudden dark, one of the men at the far wall began praying in a low, rapid murmur.
2-point gap.
I said, to Pell. He'd already run the number.
Pour that. You get a sound bell. No ward.
Yes.
Hold it. There's nothing either way.
Also yes.
A beat. Then.
I know what 2 points cost.
He wasn't supposed to. He'd cracked a bell in the small hearth 2 nights ago trying to find out, and paid for the attempt with hearing he'd never get back. But Pell had watched me press a fork to my jaw, and read metal for 3 years, and he was not slow.
You have no voice to thread.
I said.
This cost isn't yours to pay.
I know.
He turned back to the gate pins. That was all he had to say about it. The ladle was cooling. You do not let a ladle cool. I reached into my apron pocket and found the fork by shape. Worn handle, 2 tines still true. I'd kept it in the scrap bin for 20 years because keeping it meant I remembered her, and using it meant I became her. I'd carried it out of the bin 6 days ago without deciding to, and I'd had it on me every hour since. I took it out. The furnace glow caught the 2 tines. She'd set this fork against her teeth before the Ashfield pour to find her note. I'd watched her through the window and not understood what I was seeing. The cold at the windows was getting worse. The gloam was at the pasture wall, and the wall was not going to hold it. I'd let my mother die over a hollow bell. I'd sold this valley 12 months of hollow bells. There was no third option in any of that arithmetic, and I had run the numbers enough times to know. There was only the choice she'd made her whole life, while I stood outside the window deciding she'd been wrong. I set the fork against my teeth. Found the note that lived in the back of my jaw, the one that was mine alone, the one no one else could thread into falling bronze. The melt was waiting. The mold was waiting. The gloam was at the wall. I reached for the gate. Chapter 10. The Pour of Self. I turned the gate screw 1 full turn, and the ladle opened. Bronze came down the pour channel in a fold that smelled like the sun carried underground, mineral and hot and final. And I found the note in the bone behind my back teeth, the place my mother had taught me to listen when I was 7, and the foundry was loud enough to swallow everything else. The note that was mine alone, the one no tuning fork could copy because it had no frequency the system could name, only a frequency the metal could drink. I held it, and the bronze fell. The metal hit the mold, and the world got louder before it got quieter. The roar of 200 pounds of bronze finding its shape, the wet hiss where it met the green sand walls, the crack settle of the flask taking heat. I held the note through all of it. The tuning fork was still between my teeth, vibrating my own voice back through my jaw, and for 3 seconds I could hear myself and the pour and Pell's breath somewhere behind me, and the low, pressing weight of the gloam at the south wall, all at once. Then the high end went. The frequencies above a certain point cleared all at once, the way a room sounds after the highest string on a dulcimer snaps. Everything still below it, still audible, but flattened and wrong, missing the overtones that give sound its fullness. The tinnitus spiked into the gap, a whine like a quartz crystal held too long, sitting a finger's width behind my right eye. I kept singing. The note was still in the bone, through the fork's tremor in my jaw, more than through anything I could resolve as sound, that low throb that was my voice, and not my voice, the part the bronze would keep. My mother had described this once, badly, because she had already lost the words for it, along with the frequencies, like speaking into water that remembers you. The bronze rose in the mold, and its color shifted from white bright to the orange of a forge heart, and I held the note, held the note, held the note, and felt the metal drink deeper than I had planned. I tried to thin it, pull it back, meter the note out in a smaller measure, first enough to cross the ward threshold and no more. The pour drank deeper instead. This was what she had never told me, or what I had never let myself understand. The bell takes what it takes. The voice does not set the measure. The resonance ceiling of the metal sets the measure, and the voice is what reaches it. I had aimed to give just enough to cross 70. I had not accounted for what the metal could become once the voice was in it. The roar of the furnace went small. Pell was saying something, his mouth working over the rim of the mold, jaw driving something urgent, and the shape of the words was there, but the sound behind them had thinned to almost nothing, the way a voice carries from the far side of a locked door. The tinnitus whine filled the space where his voice had been, where the pour had been, where my own singing had been, and that last absence was the worst, because the note still moved through my throat and jaw, and there was no way to know if it held true, or had broken into something shapeless. The bone conduction was all I had left, the fork pressed against my teeth, the tremor of my own note felt rather than heard, proof the bell was still drinking, and I was still paying, and the mold was still not full. The level broke the lip and stopped. I closed the gate. I closed my mouth. The note died in my throat. Or if it died, I would not know that for some time, because when I closed my mouth, the tinnitus stopped whining, and the tinnitus stopping was not the relief I had spent 20 years imagining. The absence left something large and still and cottony, occupying the entire right half of my skull, a silence that had texture rather than sound, that sat in the space where hearing had been, and took up the same amount of room without making any of the same noise. On the left side, still something, the creak of foundry timbers, a wet hiss from the cooling mold, Pell's boots on the casting floor. Half the world then, half the night, gone quiet inside my head. Pell caught my arm before I understood I was falling. His grip was very warm, and his mouth was moving, and the sound that reached me was the same as standing at the bottom of a mill pond. Pressure and rhythm, nothing resolving into words. The mold steamed. Through the steam, the bell's crown was already losing its first white orange to a deeper amber, bronze finding its final shape, finding the exact geometry of the note I had given it, the note it would hold past my lifetime, past Pell's, past every Gloamtide anyone in this valley would ever live to reckon with. The system settled.
Bellcast. Resonance. 91. Masterwork ward tone. Safe to strike. 4 hours, 14 minutes.
I turned the panel toward Pell. His face did something complicated. Relief folded into terror, one expression wearing both at once, because 4 hours and 14 minutes was not tonight's problem. The south window was tonight's problem. The light through the glass had gone the color of old pewter, and not the pewter of Overcast, the pewter of something moving in front of Overcast, something that blotted rather than diffused. The gloam was not at the pasture wall any longer. It was at the foundry wall, darkening the glass from the outside in, and the bell that could drive it back was sitting in the mold glowing amber, and cooling, 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 at exactly the rate bronze cools, and not 1 degree faster. Chapter 11. The Condemnation. The bell glowed in the mold. 4 hours and 14 minutes. The system had been precise about it, as if precision were the problem. Outside the south window, pewter dark pressed closer. Pell crossed to the cooling rack, pulling the heavy iron sleeve over his hands. Reflex, habit, something to do with his body while his mind caught up. He stacked the wet rags we kept for slow cooling.
We don't have 4 hours,
He said.
do we?
He already knew the answer. The window glass had gone dark, not the comfortable dark of evening, but the shuttered dark of something moving against it, blocking the star glow from the moor. The gloam pressed slowly, methodically, testing the stone with a patience the thing did not feel, because patience implies waiting, and the gloam did not wait. It simply advanced.
No,
I said.
we don't.
The water quench was the only answer. Push bronze through thermal shock before it had properly set, and you could open a hairline fracture that wouldn't show until the bell was hung and struck, and the crack spread in one catastrophic shudder. We'd poured this bell too well to crack it now. But the alternative was letting it cool at the rate bronze cools while the gloam ate through the walls. I moved to the cold water barrel, the one kept for tool cooling and washing flux, and started drawing it up to the trough. Pell came to the other side and lifted without being asked. The foundry door opened. Cassian Voss came through it with the writ in his hand, and 3 villagers behind him who'd been driven here by the dark. Somehow in their fear they'd let him walk in front. The man in the fine coat who spoke with authority, and he had an audience again, and he straightened his spine inside it.
Foundry Alder.
The voice from the square, not the pasture. Warm, full of ledgers.
This facility is under guild condemnation pending seizure.
He crossed to the cooling rack, reached into his coat pocket, and came out with a hammer and 2 nails. The writ unrolled in his other hand, and he spread it flat across the iron cradle arms of the tackle I needed to reach the mold, and drove the first nail through the corner. The sound was obscene. Metal into iron in a room full of metal, and somehow the worst sound I'd heard all night.
Voss.
I kept my voice steady.
Get away from the tackle.
If this pour fails, my bells are the only ward in the valley.
The second nail went in.
I'd be saving these people twice over.
He believed it. That was the thing. Standing at the tackle with the condemnation writ nailed over my equipment, under the guild logic of it, he was trying to save lives. He'd called the Gloam myth for a week. He still wanted to call it that, even with the pasture behind him, even with the dark glass at his left shoulder. I crossed the floor.
The herder.
I said.
Standing in the south field, coat undisturbed. Did he look like myth to you?
Something moved across Voss's face and settled back behind the composure.
My bells.
Your bells ring true.
I said.
They ring true, and they ring hollow. The Gloam knows the difference.
I am within my guild authority to
Move.
I said.
Or I'll move you.
He did not move. He spread his arms across the tackle frame, a man who had spent his career winning arguments and still thought this was one. Behind him, the south window went entirely black, total black, sudden, as if a hand had pressed flat against the glass from outside. Then the cold came through the wall. The Gloam's cold arrived from the wrong direction, inward, as if the heat were being drawn out rather than replaced. The furnace still burned. It was only Voss who went gray. The cold hit him in the back. His spine unlocked muscle by muscle. The writ went slack in his grip, while his head turned to find the source of it, which was the foundry wall, which was stone, which was all that stood between him and what was pressing from outside. He'd spent a week calling it folk story. He'd watched the pasture from 20 yards, and now it was against the wall his shoulder touched. He ran for the window, not the door. I was across the floor before I knew I'd moved, grabbed a fistful of his coat collar with both hands, and hauled back with everything I had left, and we both went down on the stone floor in a tangle of writ paper and brass buttons. I kept my grip.
You do not go out there.
My voice came out wrong, half the frequencies missing from it, a hollow behind my right ear where the pour had taken something permanent.
Not even you.
Voss shook against me, the whole architecture of him shaking, not the fine tremor of cold but something structural, the composure he'd worn like fitted wool coming apart at every seam. The writ tore as he rolled.
Wren.
Pell's voice from the trough.
Trough's ready.
I got up, left Voss on the foundry floor with the torn condemnation writ in his hands, staring at the south wall. One of the villagers said something under his breath that I didn't catch and didn't try to. Pell had the first bucket raised.
Slow pour.
I said.
Steady.
Water hit the outer mold casing and turned to steam, with a sound like a held breath released. One long hiss that filled the foundry and fogged the rafters, and for a moment there was nothing but white steam swallowing the bronze's amber glow. No crack. No secondary sound. The wet pop of metal giving way under thermal shock. Just steam. I crouched beside the mold and pressed my palm flat against the iron casing. Not the bronze itself, which would still take the skin off, and the heat still in it told me what I needed. Pell raised the second bucket, slower, watching my hand. More steam. The rafters dripped. In the corner, Voss did not move. Then the system read the cooling curve.
Bell cooling complete. Resonance 91. Masterwork ward tone. Strike to activate.
The mold was still warm. The foundry floor was wet. Voss sat against the wall with paper in his fists. 3 villagers stood by the door, and none of them looked at him. Not the way you dismiss a man, but the way you stop checking a lock that already failed you.
I'll take the striker.
Pell said. His right. He'd stoked the furnace from cold ash, hauled broken bronze across the square in the dark, held the bellows through the worst hours of the melt while I fought the flaw line. The bell was as much his as mine. I stepped back and gave him room. Outside the south wall, the gloam was still pressing. Chapter 12. The First Toll. The striker was an ashwood mallet, head wrapped in leather, hanging on its hook since before my mother's time. Pell lifted it off with both hands, checked his grip twice, and crossed to the bell without looking at me. The mother bell hung low in the block and tackle, 3 feet off the wet foundry floor. No time to rehang her properly, and no need yet. Chest height. The right height for a man's swing. Pell planted his feet. His throat worked. The 3 villagers by the door had gone still. Voss, still against the wall with the torn writ in both fists, had stopped moving. Outside the south wall, the gloam pressed. Cold came through stone, the slow kind, with nothing seasonal in it, pulling below the sternum. The foundry still radiated heat from the pour. Between them, the air went wrong. Pell swung. The mallet connected. The bell's shape jumped. Then, nothing from the right side of my skull, and from the left, the lowest edge of a tremor, pressure more than tone, moving through jaw and sternum and the balls of my feet against wet stone. The bell's true note, the note I had poured my voice into, was gone. I had given it away. I would not hear it. So I watched instead. The gloam pulled back from the south wall. Slow, the way water retreats from a high tide mark, the way a bruise stops spreading before you can name the moment. The cold thinned, the knuckles of my left hand first, then the room at large, then the gray at the high foundry windows shifted into something less charged. Through the gap in the door the villagers hadn't fully shut, the south pasture was visible. The darkness still deep, ordinary dark, moonless dark, but the density gone. The pressed, deliberate dark that had taken Sutter's herder had lifted.
Ward tone active. Resonance 91. Masterwork ward tone. Radius. Full district. Duration. Until bell is cracked or ward is struck silent. Founder's mark. Wren Alder.
The panel held a moment and dissolved. Wet floor. Hot cold of a foundry after a long pour. The particular nothing of an ear that will no longer hear. My mother's tuning fork was still in my left hand. I didn't remember picking it up again. I set it on the edge of the mold, tines down. The 3 villagers at the door came apart from each other. They'd been braced shoulder to shoulder, not for comfort, but the way bodies brace for impact. Now one turned, opened the door, left. Then the second. The third, old Marta's daughter, I thought, though her name had gone somewhere in the long hours of the pour, pressed both hands flat over her mouth and looked at me. Her face held something. Not grief, not relief, neither thing, and not the middle of them either. Marta came through the door last, from where she'd been standing in the dark outside. I hadn't known she was there. She stopped in the middle of the foundry floor and looked at the bell, then at Pell, then at me. Her jaw moved. The sound arrived in cotton on the left and nothing at all on the right. I nodded. She closed her mouth, pressed her lips together, and nodded back. Something in her shoulders lowered, barely perceptible, like a beam finally finding its bearing. Pell was still holding the striker. He said something short, 2 syllables, probably my name, and his face had done the thing faces do when they finish something that took everything and the body doesn't know how to stand down. Shoulders up around his ears, hands shaking. He set the striker against the bell's frame and let it go, and the residual hum came up through the soles of my boots long after it should have stopped. Outside, voices. More of them now. People coming down from houses and the square, drawn by whatever had happened to the dark. Lamplight through the door gap. The silhouette of 2 figures pressing together. and the sound of it arrived at the left side of my skull stripped of warmth. Treble gone, muffled further until it faded entirely. Nothing in the right ear but a high, permanent tone that had no relation to the world outside my skull. The bell hung in the tackle, warm and dark, sounding its ward into the valley. My mother had told me that a bell keeps singing long after the strike. You have to listen very close to know when it has stopped. I stood on the wet floor with 1.5 ears and wondered whether I would ever know.
Show me your hands.
I said to Pell. He'd hauled broken bronze in the dark, worked bellows through the worst hours of the melt. The pour could have burned him and I wouldn't have noticed. He held them out, shaking badly, whole. But I hadn't checked the system log against him. Whether standing near a voice at work counted as a toll event, whether it logged anything at all against a boy who still had his hearing, I didn't know. Pell would find the notification himself if I didn't move. The wrong framing of what it had cost could break something in him that I couldn't mend. I needed to get to the log before he did. Chapter 13. What the Bell Keeps. I got to the log first. Pell was at the window, watching the Gloam pull off the south wall, his back to the room, and I moved to the mold ledger where the system stacks notifications when the founder's hands are otherwise occupied. 2 entries. I read them fast.
Founder's Toll. Voice Pour Complete. Resonance 91. Masterwork Ward Tone. Hearing Transfer. Right ear. High mid frequencies. Permanent. Casting Mark. Wren Alder.
The second entry cleared Pell. Non-voice proximity. No cost assessed. The bell having taken nothing from a boy who had no voice to give. The bell had taken what I gave it, and not reached for anything else in the room. The toll was specific. It took the voice I'd threaded into the metal, the ear that shaped that particular note, and left the room alone. I stood there longer than I needed to. Then Voss shifted on the floor and I put the ledger down. He was sitting near the south wall where I'd hauled him back, the torn writ under one knee. The villagers who'd crowded into the foundry during the panic, Hallett the miller, 2 South Pasture families, Marta standing near the door with her arms crossed, had stopped looking at him the way people look at a man holding a writ. They were looking at him the way they look at someone who needs to be told to stand up. Marta did the telling.
Voss, there's nothing left here for you. That doesn't get worse the longer you stay.
He got up without a word, his coat still pulled sideways from where I'd grabbed him. He didn't straighten it. He started for the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame, a long second in which I thought he meant to turn around, then kept walking. He had the sense not to reach for the writ pieces. The door shut behind him. The latch click came through the floor. Vibration more than sound. The right side sealed off, and staying that way. Through the window the sky had gone the gray of cold iron. The gloam burning off the moor in thin lines, as the sun reached the horizon. The south pasture wall was clear. Nothing moved at it. Marta sent the others out. Just the 3 of us then. Her and me and Pell standing at the far end of the mold, taking up less room than he actually occupied.
A year.
Marta said.
27 bells. My sister's household bought one. The Grange bought 2.
I know.
Do you?
She wasn't waiting for an answer. The floor was still wet from the quench.
Every bell I sold this year rings sound and carries no ward tone. I knew that when I poured them. I told myself it was fine because I was leaving, and the mother bell would hold until someone better came.
Marta said nothing.
And the mother bell was cracked.
And the mother bell was cracked.
Her eyes moved to the new bell on its cooling frame. My mark in the metal, the system's resonance 91 sitting in the ledger like a brand. Then back.
What does Voss's man have that rings true?
Nothing. He sold the valley. His credentials are real. His bells aren't.
She nodded. Not forgiveness.
So we have 1 bell.
1 bell. Resonance 91. It should hold the ward until the metal cracks, which won't be this generation.
And a founder who poured it.
Yes.
Outside, the moor birds were coming back. The light through the window was flat and gray, the kind that shows everything in a room for what it is, and softens nothing.
My sister trusts what I told her,
Marta said.
that her bell was sound, that the ward held, because the bronze was right.
A pause.
I need to know whether to tell her different.
Her bell won't protect her. The new ward will.
That's not what I asked.
Tell her different.
Marta pulled her coat straight and took up her kit. At the door she stopped, not quite turning.
Fix your house before you think about leaving it.
She walked out and left the door open, which I understood to be deliberate. Pell was coiling rope near the tackle when I crossed to him. His hands had stopped shaking. He worked with the focus of someone who has decided that a task means not having to be asked what he is thinking.
The system logged you clean.
I said.
No toll event. You were inside the pour radius, but you have no voice, and the bell doesn't reach for bystanders. You should know that.
He tied off the coil.
I figured.
You didn't know.
No, but I'd have stayed anyway.
For 3 years I'd called that look foolishness. Every time I caught him watching a pour with that particular set to his jaw. I'd been wrong. It was the same thing I'd felt standing at my mother's elbow at 8 years old. That what happened in the mold mattered, and that you were already answerable for it, whether you'd chosen to be or not.
I'm not leaving Greywold.
I said.
The ward bell needs a founder who can read it as it ages. There's no one else.
He turned from the tackle.
I need someone to learn the voice, not the sound bells, the real pour, the toll, how to read the ceiling before you open the gate, what the metal takes from you, and how you know what you have left before you give it.
He went still.
I refused to teach you, because I thought the craft only takes.
I stopped. The next part was harder than I'd counted on.
My mother poured true her whole life. After she was gone, all I had was her absence, and I blamed the foundry for it.
Pell waited.
She didn't die because the craft took her. She died in a single pour, in the dark, alone.
I had to look somewhere other than his face.
At 8 years old, I cast a sound bell to spare her one difficult pour. That bell left a gap in the ward. The gloam pressed through in the night, and she poured true to close it, and I wasn't there. I never told her what I'd done.
He set down the rope end.
One founder paying everything alone isn't the craft protecting people. It's someone dying slowly, at a distance from the ones they were trying to keep safe. The toll falls lighter when it's shared. I knew that at 8, and didn't want to carry it.
He was quiet for a moment. Then,
When do we start?
I crossed to the scrap drawer and opened it. The tuning fork was inside. Not the scrap bin where it had lived for 11 years, but the drawer, because at some point in the last 4 days, I'd stopped pretending I was about to throw it away. I turned and held it out.
Now, take it. Strike the bench rail and press the heel against your jaw. Tell me what you hear.
He took the fork the way you take something that has belonged to someone a long time. He struck the rail. He pressed the base to his jaw, and then he stopped moving. Hands still, jaw set, eyes somewhere past the foundry wall.
It's more than one thing. I can't.
Layers.
I said.
Flaw or quality in the metal, if you know how to read it. That's what you're learning first. True listening. The voice without the listening is noise, and noise at the pour goes into the bell and stays there.
How long until I can?
Long. The listening first. The pour only when I say.
He nodded, struck the rail again, pressed the fork to his jaw again, eyes past the wall. Outside, the valley road north was empty. Voss well up it by now, his hollow bells still hanging in their brackets across the district, ringing bright and carrying nothing. They would have to come down. Every household that bought one would need to be told. That was not a problem for some other morning. It was this morning's problem, sitting across the road while Pell learned to listen. I pulled the mold log to me and opened it to a clean page, wrote the date, the apprentice's name, the lesson begun. My mother's handwriting was on the page opposite, a poor record from 12 years ago, the ink gone brown at the edges. I didn't read it. I wrote. Outside, the moor was quiet, nothing pressed against the south wall. For now, Chapter 14. The Founder's Ear. The weeks after Gloamtide taught me a new language. I still placed the tuning fork against the casting rod before each heat, habit overriding sense, but the silence on the right side of my skull told me nothing the fork's vibration through my palm could not. I had already begun translating. The flaw line in an impure melt read as a fine tremor just below the first knuckle of my right hand. Distinct from the larger shiver of a hot pour. Distinct from the rod's natural resonance as the metal moved through it. Different metal, different fault, different tremor. Another dialect of the same tongue. Pell stood at the second position with his hands on the rod.
Nothing.
He said.
Still nothing.
The melt is clean.
I said.
That is nothing. That is what nothing sounds like when you're doing it right.
He made the face he made when he did not quite believe me, but was too careful to say so.
And when it's wrong?
Stop listening for sound. You're holding your ears open. Your palms don't have ears. They have weight and temperature and tremor. Start there.
He was quiet for a long moment. The furnace breathed. Outside, the moor lay still under a light that had been clean and honest since the morning after Gloamtide.
There.
He said, carefully, as if saying it too loud would end it.
Just under the grip. Like a finger tapping on the other side of a wall.
That's the flaw line. Mark where your hand is on the rod.
He marked it with chalk. When we poured and the bell cooled, the crack came through at that exact position.
Skill. True listening. Apprentice. Pell Finch. First successful flaw detection via casting contact. Resonance error avoided. EST. 14 PTS.
He stared at the panel for a moment, then at his hands.
Does it get louder with practice?
For a while.
I said.
Then you have to decide what you're willing to pay.
We took Voss's hollow bells down over those weeks, household by household. I carried replacements, smaller bells, sound quality, but honest sound, bells that did not pretend to be something they were not. Marta came with me twice, for the houses where the door would not have opened for me alone. Neither of us said much on those walks. The work said enough. The understanding came not in a single moment, but the way a flaw line announces itself. Gradually, then all at once through accumulating pressure. I had been teaching Pell the pour sequence for 3 weeks when I stopped mid-demonstration and stood still, both hands flat on the casting table. The furnace ticked behind me. Pell waited. My mother made the Ashfield mother bell the year I turned 8. I remembered her sharpening her voice in the foundry at night, singing scales against the furnace wall while I pretended to sleep on the cot near the door. I remembered the silence that followed the pour, her sitting at the kitchen table for 2 days, neither of us speaking, until the right side of her face stopped moving when she chewed. I had watched that pour change her, and because I was 8 and it was the most frightening thing I had ever seen, I made her a sound bell 6 months later. We had a commission. Farmer Holt's ward bell needed replacing. I was too young for any true pour, and I knew it, and I told myself I was solving a problem. I cast the bell sound and said nothing. My mother inspected it and trusted my hands, because they were her hands and she had trained them. The bell went up in Holt's south field and rang clear as glass for 11 months. The gloam pressed through on midsummer night, when the ward had run just thin enough. She went to Holt's at midnight to pour alone in the dark. No apprentice, no second pair of hands on the bellows, no time to reach true pour heat safely. She lost the last range of her right ear in that emergency, and the ear never came back, and she was dead before the following spring. 6 small true bells, the follow-on commissions she could not refuse, each one pulling frequency from an ear already spent. I had known all of this for 20 years, and understood none of it until that moment, with my hands flat on the casting table. She was not killed by the true pour. She was killed by the hollow bell I made to spare her one. I stood there until Pell's hand came to rest near mine on the wood, not touching, just close.
Wren.
I know.
I said.
I know what I did.
He did not ask what I meant. He had 3 years of knowing when to leave a silence alone. After a while, I picked up the chalk and wrote the poor sequence where we had left off. The tremor in my palm ran deep as it always had, and I worked by it, and it was enough. The writer came on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks into the teaching. She was young, travel-dusted, and she named a valley 4 hours east, Brennan's Folly, which I knew only as a mark on the district maps. Pell went for the water bucket before I said a word. The horse had been ridden hard. Marta appeared at the foundry door the way she always appeared when anything came down the valley road.
The Folly's mother bell cracked last autumn.
She said.
Been ringing dead since the thaw.
The writer pulled a folded letter from her coat. The wax seal was broken.
When is Gloamtide in your valley?
I said. She met my eyes.
17 days.
17 days. 6 hours to true pour heat. 4 more to cool and strike. 3 days of travel with the equipment. 2 for the pour itself if nothing went wrong. I went to the tool drawer. My mother's tuning fork lay where I had put it, tines clean, handle worn smooth at the grip. The weight of it settled into my palm the way it always had, the way it had settled into hers before it was mine. The craft protects because it costs. Not in spite of the cost. Because of it. A sound bell rang the same note and carried nothing. The ward held only because the bell held something that had been paid for. My mother had known this. She had known it with her whole life. I had spent 20 years believing the cost was the thing to be avoided, and the hollow bell had been my proof, and the hollow bell had been wrong. The rider was watching me.
Pell.
I said.
Bank the furnace. We leave at dawn.